I'm very sorry to everybody who's joining us online today. We've had a few technical issues and we have unfortunately sacrificed the video in favour of the audio. So I'm hoping that the audio is going to come through to you this afternoon. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the Ngunnawal people of this region. I'd also like to welcome all of you here to the seminar this afternoon. Because we're running a little bit late, I hope that our panellists won't mind me asking them to introduce themselves. I would just be giving the same information as you've already read in the registration form, and they of course know and can better explain their interest and motivation for being involved in this research. I will just run through their names and introduce them. We have Dr. Jordan McSweeney, a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Hello. We have Dr. Emily Corner, Senior Lecturer at Criminology at the Centre for Social Research and Methods at the Australian National University. And we also have Pia van der Zandt, Director of the Connected Communities Team in New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet. So welcome, Pia. I'm Dr. Melissa Lovell. I think we missed that part for those of you on the recording. I'm the convener of the Freilich Project here at the Australian National University. I'm very happy to go into that a little bit more at the end, but given the time situation, I would just like to move on straight away and hear more about this fantastic report so that we can launch it and enjoy a little glass of wine as well. So ask Jordan to come up now.
Grand. Thanks, Melissa, and thank you, I suppose, more broadly to the Freilich Project for hosting this report launch. And thanks very much to Pia and Emily for joining us this evening. I'm really looking forward to your sort of input. So as Melissa said, my name is Jordan McSweeney. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance here at the, well, not here, at the University of Canberra, rather. And on behalf of the project team, Professor Selene Erjan, Professor John Dryzek and Associate Professor Peter Violent from the University of New South Wales, I'm very happy to be launching our report, Building Democratic Resilience, Public Sphere Responses to Violent Extremism. So we're quite a diverse team with expertise on deliberative democracy, on multiculturalism, and my own expertise, I suppose, on far-right extremism. And in this project, we seek to combine this to better understand the threats that violent extremism poses to democratic societies. We're very thankful, of course, to the New South Wales Government for providing funding to support the project as part of their 2022 Countering Violent Extremism program, which has really allowed us the space to try and make these connections across our fields. And so the research that we've done for this report, and also continue to do as part of a wider multi-institutional project funded by the Australian Research Council, seeks to offer alternative approaches to the challenges of violent extremism by drawing on the theory of deliberative democracy and the public sphere. Next slide, Peter. So in this report, we basically try to do three things differently. First, we try to shift the focus from security to democracy by asking what deliberative democracy can offer in terms of dealing with the challenges of violent extremism. Violent extremism poses, I suppose, a pretty obvious threat to human safety and life, but less examined is the ways in which violent extremism sows fear and discontent to radically redraw the boundaries of multicultural liberal societies. Second, in reconceptualizing democratic resilience, we're trying to shift the focus from regime type to the quality of the public sphere. So to date, research on democratic resilience is focused primarily on the capacity for political systems to resist democratic backsliding, creeping authoritarianism, and things like that. But in this research, what we're doing is instead thinking about democratic resilience in terms of the public sphere and the quality of the communications in the aftermath of shocks like a violent extremist attack. And so we conceptualize a resilient public sphere as one which sustains integrative and tolerant discourses and deliberation when subjected to shocks, while a fragile public sphere would be one which descends into polarization, fragmentation, and loses the capacity for the inclusive deliberation on which our democracy depends. And thirdly, we try to shift the focus of resilience from individuals and communities to the actors and institutions of the public sphere, which includes government and news media. And we see this as a way of, I suppose, supplementing rather than replacing existing ways of thinking about resilience by turning our attention to the quality of communication in the wake of violent extremist attacks. Next slide, thanks, Peter. So this report draws on interviews with New South Wales government stakeholders, civil society organisations, journalists and academics working on and around the areas of violent extremism, social cohesion and democracy. And these interviews were supplemented with document analysis of publicly available materials on the New South Wales CVE program, that's Countering Violent Extremism, as well as a review of international best practice in this space, as well as social cohesion more broadly. And so drawing on this empirical work and through the theory of deliberative democracy and its conceptualization of the public sphere, we identify 7 key factors that matter for thinking about building democratic resilience. And I want to touch on, I suppose, 3 of these quite briefly today. Don't really have time to go through all of them. But before I do, I think it's quite important to note that, you know, these findings and the possible ways forward that they suggest for building democratic resilience, they're not prescriptive. They're not a sort of checklist of things that we can tick off and say, great, now we've got democratic resilience. Rather, they're a series of questions or perhaps issues that public sphere actors, including, say, the New South Wales Government, but also other jurisdictions and other practitioners like media, other institutions rather, like media, should engage in thinking about ways to address the challenges violent extremism poses to our democracy. Next slide, thanks, Peter. So the first of these that I want to talk about is how political leaders talk about violent extremism. The sort of language that they use and the performances that they engage in relation to violent extremism has an enormous effect on the health of our public sphere and by extension, the health of our democracy. Our research shows that speeches given by prominent public figures in the aftermath of a violent extremist attack will serve to define the way that the events are interpreted. They'll shape the community's understanding of events, and they will set, crucially, the tone for future deliberation and policy formation in relation to the attack and their aftermath. And so it's really important, we think, that government continue to develop speech guidelines for public-facing government actors and political leaders to respond in the aftermath of a violent extremist attack or a threat in a democratically resilient way. And what that means, for example, is centering the stories of victims and survivors rather than having a perpetrator-driven narrative, contextualizing and localizing the risks of violent extremism rather than using inflammatory language, supporting targeted communities rather than treating them as potential vectors of concern, and importantly, reiterating the democratic character of the political system rather than sacrificing some of these values on the altar of security. Next slide. So secondly, how an inclusive collective identity is constructed in the public sphere is very important from the perspective of democratic resilience. Here, we're particularly interested in the role that symbols and performances and other sort of public rituals can play in articulating an inclusive and democratically resilient collective identity. Acts of commemoration and memorialization in the wake of violent extremist attacks are a particularly important site for this, we think. And this is because commemoration and memorialization can bring community together to heal after a crisis. However, it can also present a really important opportunity to foster democratic resilience by contesting the imagery of violence and promoting the democratic, inclusive, and tolerant character that we sort of want to see in our society. Now, there is actually quite a noticeable policy gap in this space. And so we believe that there's a real need for some clear policy guidance to ensure commemoration and memorialization centres the needs of victims, survivors, and first responders, adopts time-sensitive implementation strategies, which is, I think, particularly pertinent around the Bali anniversary and the ongoing issues around the Kuta bomb site, and also ensures public consultation and participation in planning to make sure it meets the needs of the community at large. So the third thing that we think is really very important for building democratic resilience, and it's probably one of my pet pet aspects of the project is the role of media and news media and how it reports on violent extremism. This was really a key barrier to an inclusive public sphere identified repeatedly in our interviews through the way that media covers violent extremism, perpetrators and those affected by it. In particular here, it's sensationalist reporting that can potentially undermine the public sphere by furthering the reach of extremist narratives, while harmful framing of impacted communities can lead to fracturing of the public sphere unnecessarily through, say, stigmatisation and marginalisation. Reporting on violent extremism really needs to be guided by an approach that informs the public without giving violent extremists the oxygen of amplification. And so we think that there's a real opportunity here for the New South Wales and other governments to work with media and support media in developing best practices for harm minimisation reporting on violent extremism. Similar to guidelines we already have in place for harm minimisation reporting on suicide and that are being developed with relation to violent extremism in other jurisdictions like the EU. So, being conscious of time, wrapping up, part of what we're doing in this report is trying to basically demonstrate that, you know, democratic resilience is not an off-the-shelf solution. Like democracy, it requires work to build and sustain. But our research shows that democracy can take deliberate action outside of shocks or crises like a violent extremist attack to build that resilience and enhance the quality of public communications and our democracy. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us here today, especially Emily and Pia, and I'm really looking forward to your reflections on our work. And thanks again to Melissa and the Freilich Project for hosting us here this evening. The report was like a really interesting opportunity for us as scholars to take a novel approach to thinking through this pressing issue and to see what deliberative democracy can offer for addressing it. So we're, again, very grateful to the New South Wales Government for supporting us in this respect. And of course, if you'd like to actually read the report, this is just a very small teaser, although I do look forward to expanding on it perhaps in the discussion. You can access it via the hyperlink, which I have just checked is working. You can Google the report title, and thanks to our excellent search engine optimization, it should be third in the Google list. Or you can just email me, which might be easiest, and I can just forward you a copy. And I suppose just to finish, I mean, while this research was conducted for and supported by New South Wales and focused on the New South Wales case, we do think that there are lessons there for other jurisdictions, and this is something we're looking at as part of our ongoing ARC project. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Jordan, and thanks everyone for coming and for the introductions. I wanted to acknowledge also that we're on Ngunnawal country, and I wanted to pay respects to elders past and present. I grew up in Canberra, so I'm always very grateful for the beautiful caretaking of Ngunnawal elders for the land I grew up on, and I wanted to acknowledge any Aboriginal colleagues in the room as well. So I was just going to give some brief reflections, but I should start by saying when we met Selene and Peter and Jordan in New South Wales, me and my team in New South Wales Government, we were just sort of wondering how we hadn't met earlier, because it was kind of a bit of a match made in heaven between us. We had been thinking about these things for quite some time, and obviously you've been thinking about these things for much longer and writing and travelling the world talking about them. So it was just wonderful to find each other, and we are so excited about this work. It's been a wonderful process developing the project, but then we're really happy with the report and its outcomes as well. I suppose you might be wondering why the New South Wales Government, particularly led by a Conservative Premier over a very long period of time, would invest in this work. And I think really this is a little bit about our role in government as stewards, and irrespective of the political masters, there are people in government who see themselves as stewards, and we've got licence to be that kind of, to serve that function. And At the moment, democracy is extremely challenged. We're living in a polarised world, luckily not to the extent the US sees here in Australia, but we have some pretty significant challenges. And I think with rising rates of inequality and poverty and culture wars and other things, we've got midterm elections in the US, Victorian election, New South Wales election, and then with hopes a referendum, we collectively are extremely worried in New South Wales about what that means for our communities, and particularly minority and diverse communities in New South Wales, who are always at the are the most harmed in these sort of debates. So that sort of brought us to this project, and really we've been really fascinated and by the learnings and by the recommendations that Jordan just has gone through. I think in New South Wales we've been really lucky to be in peacetime, if you can call it that, for quite a period. We haven't had any incidents of terrorism or extremism in the last few years. So obviously we were very shocked by the Christchurch massacre. It had huge impacts for people in our state. And since then, we've luckily not had other incidents, but it's meant that we've been able to invest in some of the sort of deep prevention work that this report and this research offers us, really thinking about our communities and the connectedness of our communities and the strength of our bonds, and I suppose trying to find a way to have a community that allows rigorous debate, is able to be stretched in its parameters for political debate and other debate, but they can come back together again. And also thinking about the incidents of violent extremism, and that it's not just about the incident or, God forbid, a terrorist attack. It's actually about the harm caused more broadly in terms of the impacts on minority groups in particular, but also broader social cohesion. So I just wanted to comment on three, not the same three, but two of the same three that you highlighted, Jordan. So the sort of the findings I'm finding most interesting for us is the focus on the importance of strategic leadership communications. So we are really, one of the things we're really proud of in New South Wales is we have an evidence base that informs the Premier's talking points about extremism and social cohesion and terrorism. So if there were to be a terrorist attack tomorrow in New South Wales, or even a significant extremist incident, there are cabinet level approved talking points that he would use, and the rest of the senior cabinet ministers have agreed to use those. And the reason that's important for us is because I suppose the federal government has often used counter narratives. There's lots to talk about the importance of counter narratives. In New South Wales, we decided that actually that is not our job in government. Our job is to look after and try and influence political leaders to speak in ways that bring communities together, don't divide communities. Previous political leaders, particularly at the Australian government level, have been very divisive, and that has huge impacts in our communities. So we worked really hard to get an evidence base using international examples, and then co-draft language with community leaders about how they would like their Premier to talk about an extremist incident or a terrorist incident. And we have that locked in, not that all political ministers would necessarily use them. Obviously, we've got a few Barnaby Joyce equivalents in our government as well, but it at least has the rigour and the discipline across the bureaucracy. So it goes all the way down from the Christchurch incident, for example. Those talking points were interpreted by schools, turned into fact sheets for principals, so principals could talk about the impact in their schools. It was sent to the Grafton Mayor, it was given to the Grafton Correction Centre, where there were pretty big issues after the Christchurch incident. So that's one thing we're really, really proud of. But we are, obviously you need to refresh those, and there's been some media reporting of the return of women and children from Syria, for example, who were married to foreign fighters. So that will be a significant event for New South Wales if that happens. We don't have information more about that, but we are looking at what we can do on the strategic comms about that, just so that we're really clear about how we use an evidence base to manage unifying and cohesive communication. So that's one implementation already of your work. Just two others very briefly. One is I really love the work and the rationale and the evidence you put forward about the importance of deliberating with the civil society organisations and the broader sectors, private sector as well, in particular that sense, that idea of consequentiality. So that's been really picked up by us. We're actually putting it in our Secretary's State of the Sector speech, which he's giving in a few weeks. Just that idea that we do co-design, and obviously every government does consultation, but no one really wants to be doing consultation anymore. Like, we all should be doing co-design. But I think the step you've told us about and have it evidence-based for is that idea that we go back and we say, what you told us influenced us in this way, and we're doing it differently because of what you told us. And obviously we can't always do that, because sometimes those things don't get, they're not agreed. But I really think we want to do better on that. And that sort of concept of consequentiality that you talk about in your research is really going to really frame our work going forward. And the last one is just, you mentioned this one, Jordan, too, just that idea about building a collective identity, and particularly in ways that when you memorialise after events. That one was probably like light bulb for me when you wrote about that. I think we haven't done that nearly well enough. And I think particularly your comments about that you memorialise and in a way that also staunchly sets out what our identity is and what we're committed to. And I think you've got a quote from the Norwegian Prime Minister in response to one of the attacks. And I think that is such a nuanced, it's so, yeah, it's really interesting to learn about that. And I think we certainly didn't do that in the memorial response to Lint. So there is a memorial, but it doesn't in any way invite people to reflect on us as a community and what we stand for. And I have been thinking a lot about the impact of COVID in New South Wales, particularly in Sydney, when we heinously locked down some communities and didn't lock down communities where I live, for example. And just, there's been quite some discussion in government about what we need to do to memorialise COVID, because it's not even a thing anymore. No one really talks about it. And people had such terrible suffering through COVID. And in Sydney, it was awful for those communities that were locked down. And I've been thinking about whether there's any ability to memorialise that in a way that speaks to our values and our identity. So they're just my reflections, but the work will continue in terms of what we will do with it. And obviously we're sort of scheming about what more we could do with your group. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I feel a little bit like the elephant in the room here. My research focuses on the perpetrators of such events. I'm deeply honoured to be here, because actually reading the report, it's amazing how similar the processes are in terms of what we need to do at both ends of the spectrum. So my research rests mainly in radicalisation and counter-radicalisation spaces. I've done quite a bit of work in risk assessment, which is interestingly meant to be more CVE, but ends up being far more CT, which really sort of that I think it's number 2, how we understand and implement CVE versus CT programming is really important, because actually the consequences of not doing so have meant that certain processes that go across every state and territory in Australia, set by the federal government, leave lots of confusion. And I've interviewed hundreds of practitioners now who are all in this space, and they have very clear ideas of what they want to do and what their needs are and what the needs of the people they're assessing are. But the messaging coming down from above them is very different to what they know their role is to be. So it's not just, for me, reading this report, it's not just about building democratic resilience, it's about building resilience in general and helping understand how inadvertently, by building stronger communities, you can build much safer communities. So a lot of my work sits within how people radicalize in the first place. And it comes down to the same points that you make in this report. It comes down to thinking about when people feel marginalized, when entire communities feel marginalized, and then people within those communities feel marginalized. It comes down to the online behaviors and not really understanding what people are being exposed to online. So there's huge portions of not only literature, but practice run by NGOs, run by people who governments then bring in to help teach them about these things, to help understand how a lack of regulation on platforms is leading to people being drawn into narratives online that can mean that these people become more susceptible to radicalizing. We've all seen it, particularly here in Canberra, with the Freedom Brigade that arrived last year very loudly and stayed around for a while. Those people spent 2 years basically in isolation from other people. So I'm currently running a project where we're surveying the general population to try and understand what happened during COVID to make people sort of develop these grievances that seem to come from nowhere, but they've come from somewhere. And the online space has really perpetuated that, because one of the things that happened during COVID is the world went more online. And we had a complete lack of regulation with what was happening. And there wasn't consistent messaging coming out there anyone to help us understand what we can view online, when you do view things online, how to sort of think more critically about it, or to understand exactly what these things mean. And then the final one, so this one always gets me in my research, how media reports on violent extremism. So most of my research has sat squarely within the mental health space. I look particularly at how people might be more vulnerable to radicalization due to their mental health. I also look at how engagement in violent extremism can affect people's mental health going forward. And one of the things that I've consistently found is that the sensationalization of how we report extremism really can affect. It affects complete research outcomes, which then affects policy outcomes. So for example, one of the things I always draw back to is when people speak about an individual who committed an act of extremism who had a mental health problem, there's this dichotomy of either or. We sort of try and sensationalize their mental health problems over what they did, or it goes completely the opposite way, and we sensationalize exactly what they did over their mental health problems. And what that can do is cause huge divide in communities, particularly communities who feel marginalized already because of where that individual came from. So as you'll probably hear, I'm from the UK, spent a lot of time working with Prevent in the UK, which everyone knows is probably the worst example in the world of how we can marginalize communities. Prevent has done a lot of firefighting when it comes to the reporting of how the Prevent program works, because it initially suffered such huge backlash. And having worked with Prevent and having to continue working with people who work within that, so the psychologists who work within that, we know that the idea of what Prevent was is very different than what Prevent turned out to be. So I think that one of the things is, moving forward maybe with this, is it's not just about what's said at the start, and it's not just about the intention, it's about how that follows through. So these findings can all be applied to a process model, to looking at how things change over time and how flexible agencies need to be in terms of continuing to monitor how their programs work, and how much we can start with unifying language and then it very quickly turn into divisive language if we don't do things like that. So I hope that makes sense. I really enjoyed reading the report. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you to all three of you. We do have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has some. I would just ask that you come up and speak back at the podium when you're answering the question, and try to incorporate the question into your response so that those who are at home can understand what the gist of the conversation. So, any questions?
Yes, so I was wondering if it was possible to, for really any of you with questions or wise teaching, go into a little bit more about how, maybe potentially an example of how, like, you propose essentially for framing to have sort of impact on how people in public sphere respond to violent extremism or terrorist attack, something similar to that. Just because I'm in my cursory reading on the subject, as you mentioned before, people are very persuasive to interact on the internet. So I wonder specifically, in regards to internet and media on the internet, how framing potentially help the situation lead to particularly divisive outcomes following
Hey, so thank you for your question, which is for those listening in at home, about the importance of framing, particularly in I guess, media context, and how that can perhaps impact how these attacks reverberate through the public sphere in our democracy in terms of divisiveness and so on. I think the short answer is, particularly with respect to an example, if we think about how the American Muslim community was talked about post 9/11 compared perhaps to the response in the wake of the Christchurch massacre in terms of trying to welcome or rather reinforce the belonging of New Zealand Muslims. I think more broadly, what matters in this framing question, and particularly with respect to media, is how, or my interest is particularly in how the capacity for extremist narratives and actions to be circulated and legitimized through media coverage and media framing. And sticking with the Christchurch example, I think it's really interesting to reflect on how the press initially covered the attack, and this extends to Australia and stuff. So the attack was occurring, aspects of the shooter's manifesto were being read out live to air on television. This obviously was an excellent opportunity for the shooter for his narrative to reach a massive audience, which was the intent. By the time of the trial, most New Zealand media companies, all the big newspapers and stuff, had come to a collective agreement that in covering the trial, they would not report on statements supporting white supremacy, gestures supporting white supremacy, and so forth, because they recognized that it was important, both in terms of respecting victims, survivors, families of those affected, but also in terms of just like making a statement for what has and what doesn't have a place in New Zealand society, that these sort of messages were not going to be given a platform and the legitimation that comes with them by being front page of a major daily newspaper or something. So hopefully that addresses your point. I'll hand over to Emily up here if they want to.
It's a great question, thank you. I just have a couple of comments. One is that obviously Jacinda Ardern is our high watermark in terms of response and framing a government response, and then that led to a empathic community response. So look, obviously her political views seem to be informed by kindness and compassion anyway, and that's a value she holds. But there are a lot of people who talk about that her security and intelligence services would have told her to say that immediately because of the risks of retaliation after an incident. So the comments made in, as you say, the framing is really important, not just because of the impacts on the community, but to stop further attacks or retaliations. And I think it's sort of, they're one and the same, I suppose. So I would just say that. But also, I think what we've really come to understand, and sadly through the Christchurch experience, is just that often it's other community leaders, mayors, people you don't even expect who end up becoming the framers as well, in addition to governments in response to an attack. And that's why it's very helpful to have this research, and also really interesting for us to, like, we work very closely with community leaders of all persuasions, church leaders as well as diverse community leaders, because they are the ones that we would be calling immediately if there was an incident or an attack, because it's really very much up to them as well to help frame the community response. The president of the Australian National Imams Council is a wonderful man called Imam Shadi, and he sent out talking points to all imams around Australia for the Friday sermon immediately after so the attack happened on a Friday at Friday prayers, but the following Friday he had coordinated unifying talking points that really spoke to compassion and kindness and not inflammatory, obviously, and he circulated them across all imams around Australia, and a lot of them use that for their sermons. So just it's incredible that the sort of how important that framing is that you mentioned. The only thing I'd mention is just about media. So we've since the report was written, we've held a workshop with all the executives of major newspapers and traditional media about the amplification of extremist narratives and how they contribute to that and what they could do. And I was saying this to Jordan before, our idea was that we may end up with some sort of guidelines for media, which is what you've recommended in your research. But of course, we couldn't tell them to do that because we're government and we can't be telling media what to do. But actually, in the end, there was a really strong consensus in the room amongst the news editors that they didn't want guidelines for a whole heap of reasons, but they did admit to a number of things, including that when the terrorist is a white supremacist, the story then goes into how can the angelic boy end up being this person who's done this, and there's a lot of reporting on their background and what went wrong and all sorts of things. But when it's an ISIS-inspired terrorist, the conversation just stops when on the day of the terrorist attack. There's no reporting at all of that, and they're immediately there's no interest in their background. So there's sort of double standards as well that happen in media. I mean, there's lots more you can talk about with media, but part of that framing piece as well.
Any other questions?
I guess just building on that response there is how the size of things that aren't said, how they impact democratic resilience, whether it may be media or other community organisations. So how are the things that aren't found said impacting democratic resilience?
Hey, thank you, Matt. For those listening in at home, it's a question about how silence or what isn't said in the sort of framing and response to an extremist attack and how that impacts democratic resilience. And it's a really good point, and one that we probably haven't thought through too much. Certainly it's not something that I think we've directly engaged with. My off-the-cuff thinking is, of course, in not reiterating the inclusive, tolerant, democratic character of our society in the wake of attack, we, or government or community leaders or whoever is making statements, media, doing the framing, leave open the possibility that those sorts of things that presumably we see as desirable, living in a liberal, multicultural, democratic society, may not become central to attempts to renegotiate and understand and commemorate these attacks. So I think there's the possibility, of course, that if that kind of stuff is not said, then it doesn't sort of end up on the agenda, and it's an opportunity lost to strengthen democratic resilience. I suppose the flip side of that as well is in Australia, there's a great sort of timidity around like talking about white supremacy, right? And sort of dealing with that. And for example, taking ownership of the Christchurch shooter as an Australian who was radicalised in Australia, who was deeply connected to the Australian far right prior to going to Europe and then eventually returning and going to New Zealand and carrying out that attack. So I think there's a serious issue in terms of our capacity to process these kinds of traumas and understand where these attacks come from, I guess, if we're not willing to sort of name it, sort of have a critical reflection upon the place of race and white supremacy in Australian society that produces an individual like the Christchurch shooter. So hopefully that answers your question, Matt.
So I will just add that when things go unsaid, it actually leads to further marginalisation, because we're not learning about entire communities and we're not understanding that messaging can be so important as, so positive messaging, we're not getting any of that because we're not fully understanding how these communities function, the role of these communities. If we don't understand the background of someone, and we don't understand their culture, and we don't understand, and we just go, oh, it doesn't matter, they were an ISIS supporter. What we're not doing is we're not absorbing those communities into the culture that is Australia, which then leads to further marginalisation of entire communities and can weaken democratic resilience that way as well. You know, by leaving people, by just ignoring the fact that attackers have different backgrounds and people come from different places and there's different reasons for why they radicalise. And if we don't fully understand that, we're leaving people out, and you're not getting a really rich picture of what extremism looks like in Australia, which will then affect how you respond to extremism in Australia.
I've just got a couple of comments. So again, it's such a good question. I can tell you with academics because the questions are excellent. Yeah, so great question. I would say also, not in addition to not naming, but also things like vanilla naming, like using the term ideologically motivated violent extremism instead of using it and instead of saying white, racist, nationalist extremism. So I agree with everything both of you have said. Just the fear sometimes of governments, or certainly Australian governments, to have named white nationalist extremism and minimised the impact of that. So also just leaving the vacuum, you mean you're leaving the framing to others, and often it becomes very polarised. I think you've then got risks of mis and malinformation that would arise. I think one of the, I mean, might be good to end on a positive, but the AEC is the Australian Electoral Commission, your wonderful Electoral Commission here in Canberra, is a great example of what happens when they've actually not allowed a vacuum to happen, and they've been extremely active and forward-leaning and taken quite some risks in the way that they engage with voters during the election, called things out, constantly flooding social media with positive factual information and challenging people when they were being you know, disruptive and deliberately stoking. So that's a good example of actually not leaving it as well.
We do have one question from our online audience, so I'll read that out for you. What do the panel think about the necessity to define and discuss what is meant by extremism and how it tends to not include state extremism and the propensity to interchangeably use extremism and violent extremism in the discourse?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and so they heard the question online. Oh, they've read the question, of course. Yeah, so we've been criticised by not specifically defining violent extremism in New South Wales. I think there is a definition at the Commonwealth level, but we are really clear to point out that we are not. So we're certainly not worried about radicalisation as such. It's about, because a lot of people are radicalised, and in fact, a lot of the big reforms in the world have come by people being radicalised. All of us would have probably young adult children who are, you know, doing some wonderful work in terms of climate change and other activism. So it's about the propensity to support the use of violence for extremist views, and that's where certainly government sees it has a role in not necessarily criminalising, but certainly responding in some way, and whether that's with support services, engagement services, and obviously as it gets to higher risk to community safety and life, it becomes more in the sort of criminal realm.
Yeah, following on from Pia and echoing a lot of that, I mean, something we do point out in the report is the lack of a consistent and standardised policy definition of violent extremism within the New South Wales CVE context, and I suppose the potential that creates perhaps for policy creep, for difficulties around assessment, but I think also most pressingly, and this is, you know, an ongoing debate in the literatures around CVE and violent extremism and so forth, as Pia indicated, I mean, holding an extreme view or belief is not necessarily a predictor of violence. Many who hold extreme or radical or whatever beliefs will never actually commit an act of violence. The incidence is extremely low. And so, of course, I think we need to be very careful and precise in the language which we use and how that is then used to inform policy action, particularly in a sort of intervention sense. I know Emily mentioned the British UK Prevent program before. In that, at least in early iterations, indications of radicalizing towards extremism included increased religiosity in schools, growing your beard, becoming socially distant, much of which sounds like normal teenage behavior. And of course, that led to the persecution, stigmatization, marginalization of countless numbers of Muslim youth in British schools as well, crucially. So yeah, I think it's an extremely pressing question, one which I don't have a sort of straightforward, neat definitional answer for, except to say that it's something that we need to continue to grapple with. And in our report, we suggest perhaps in the New South Wales policy context to adopt an understanding which links it directly to the threat posed to democracy and democratic functioning.
Question over here.
I was wondering if it was possible for any of the members to elaborate a little more on how they feel that in particular gender setting going into for a little bit about how that can be used, and maybe give some examples as well on how that can be used to target and limit the violent aspects of extremism without potentially further marginalizing what may already people who may already have extremism into feeling like they're further pushed out, unable to address topics.
So for those playing at home, it's a question about agenda setting and, if I understood correctly, basically about how we can sort of do it in a way that still allows those who have extreme views and are not necessarily violent to continue to participate. Is that?
Yeah, essentially that without pushing them towards violence. If they
right.
have such
yeah. Okay. So not sort of further pushing people to violence. It's a very good question, one that I don't have a straightforward answer to. I mean, there's a, and this is actually sort of where Peter's expertise really comes in around the question of tolerance and the capacity for our democracies and public sphere to tolerate sort of contentious and deliberate over contentious issues. How do we, maintain a public sphere that is able to, I guess, contain and process contentious ideas, potentially extreme ideas, allow people to have a voice without pushing them further to, potentially violence, but also importantly, ensuring that their capacity to express their contentious views doesn't marginalize other participants in the public sphere and community. So it's my particular research interest is around the far right and white supremacy, and there's a very live debate around, should you interview Nazis in the press? I mean, they have a view, should we talk to them type thing? And I don't think that there is a good reason, frankly, to interview a neo-Nazi about their neo-Nazi beliefs in a public setting. But I think it's also important to, and thinking about Emily's work as well, at the more sort of individual intervention level, there are properly structured conversations, exit conversations and the like, that can be had to pull people who have these views away from potentially radicalizing to violence, while also allowing them to sort of speak their mind, as it were, but also in a way that is controlled and doesn't, I guess, for lack of a better term, pollute or poison the rest of the public sphere and expose others to harm and violence. I think that's a really important part of it as well. Hopefully that addresses your question.
Did anyone else want to say anything on that question? Or a new question?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Emily, and Peter. Thanks for your important for your encouraging comments on our report as well. As you know, we love working with you and your unit.
I guess one of the key challenges for us while working on this report was also to find the right tone, to make it accessible, to make it clear for government officials to understand and engage as academics. I mean, Peter is a political theorist, and I work at the intersection of political theory and empirical research as well. We have a lot of big abstract ideas, and I guess what took us quite a long time as well while working on this report was writing, rewriting, and really trying to make what we're saying as accessible as possible. And during this process, very often, especially with Jordan, when we were interviewing various people and when we were really trying to simplify our ideas and list them in a way that speaks to everybody, and what hinders democratic resilience? What enables democratic resilience? And one thing that we sort of discussed a lot but didn't capture in the report is racism. So we often, when people were saying, oh, we need to have a multicultural, inclusive public sphere that doesn't rely on us versus them kind of thinking, and that shouldn't have a division. There were times that we were brainstorming and thinking, what is it? Is this racism? And so I would like to hear your reflections. What do you think how big and serious the issue of racism is in New South Wales and in Australia in general? Because I think if we want to be really crystal clear here, what hinders democratic resilience, building and maintaining democratic resilience is to, if we have a racist society, that's the sort of main obstacle for building democratic resilience. So we didn't capture this along these lines in the report, but I would like to hear your reflections on the use of the term racism.
Now I'm regretting the academic audience at this point. I don't even know how to summarise Professor Celine's comment for those at home, but it's about asking if I would comment on, I suppose, the prevalence of racism and the impacts of that in our society as the main challenge to democratic resilience. Yes, in short, is your answer. I mean, inherently racist. I think obviously our whole being here on First Nation country and the beginnings of our western part of our colonisation here, it started off in a colonial racist underpinnings, and I think it's been yeah. I mean, if you then think about the impacts of the White Australia policy, we haven't yet come to terms with all of that, I don't think, and I think for a country as multicultural as us, and I think New South Wales, or Victoria as well, but certainly New South Wales is a very, very multicultural community. We've got hundreds of different languages and religions. I don't think we deeply yet understand what that means and how to keep that cohesive in a sort of, yeah, in a true sense. But we also don't respond well. We don't count, for example, incidents of Islamophobic attacks. We don't count incidents of anti-Semitism as two examples. There's no agreed data set on how to count attacks on people because of their race. So we have the anti-discrimination functions in New South Wales, but they've been less and less funded over years, and that's certainly not a key part of the government's functions certainly now. So I think there's lots of things we could do to improve that across the board, and probably we've seen a diminution of that over the last 10, 20 years. But I'd say also it's not just racism, it's just intolerance of anything other than whiteness and heteronormative whiteness, I would say. So there's lots of other communities who would feel marginalised and would have frequent experiences of othering all the way through to, you know, criminal assault. So yeah, I think there's enormous amounts of things we ought to do, and I feel quite hopeful with the government change in the Australian government change, that there might be more of that conversation we can have about social cohesion, about true multicultural values, what that actually means, being much more overt about that, and then having you know, a sort of a a social democratic discussion about it and a sort of a commitment to that at all levels of government and different sectors. So, yeah. You would have also been welcome to include that in your report.
It's required to do research there, and it's we're looking to framing is required research.
Yes, yes.
I noticed there's still another question or two left, but unfortunately we're going to have to wrap up at least the formal part of this conversation at this point. I would like to thank everybody online who managed to persist through the problems that we had with our technology, all of you that are here in this room this afternoon, and thank you for your excellent questions. And of course, our panelists who have shared so much of their expertise and knowledge, and of course launched a very important report that is clearly already having some fantastic impact out there in the community. So please join me in thanking our panelists. And please do feel free to stay and grab a glass of wine and continue the conversation in the room. Thank you, everybody.